Welcome to the Zenergy Podcast. I'm your host, Karan Takhar. This is the third interview in a series of interviews I've been conducting at DC Climate Week. Today I have the pleasure of speaking with Alan Young. Alan is a senior advisor on Extractives Strategy in the World Circular Economy Forum for the Circular Economy Leadership in Canada. He is also the Director of MERG. We speak about the intersection of extractives and sustainability in Canada and North America, what the biggest barriers are to getting more processing capacity, and Alan provides a helpful overview of the mining industry in Canada. Finally, we touch on Canada's recent election, and Alan shares one policy that he believes could be a game changer in the mining industry if implemented. I'm thrilled to share with you my conversation with Alan Young. Alan, it is truly a pleasure to have you on the podcast. Thank you for taking the time. Really excited to dive into your work in the circular economy. I haven't interviewed that many people outside of John within this space, so really excited to learn more, especially at a time where critical minerals are becoming a really core focus of the conversation. And with that, I envision a lot more companies are starting to take their supply chains much more seriously, including exploring whether a circular economy or approach makes sense for them. And to kick us off, as I was researching your background, what struck me was you work across many different areas, including NGOs, public policy, even with Indigenous communities. Would love to hear what drew you to this intersection of extractives and sustainability, and what keeps you focused here today.
Well, my academic background is sort of minimal, but it's in geography, resource economics, and political science. And so I was always interested in the extractives, like forestry, mining. Being Canadian, it's sort of in your face. And so, and we had big problems. So when I was going to school, there were massive protests around forestry, big mine collapses and things like that. So if you're in that field, you're kind of drawn into it. And so what I found quite quickly, and it was almost by accident, was I got drawn into a multi-stakeholder initiative called the Whitehorse Mining Initiative, where labor unions, companies, Indigenous municipalities, and environmentalists, of course, and I was running the Yukon Conservation Society at the time. And it was fascinating. It took 2 years of negotiations. But I learned so much about what was motivating people on all fronts. But businesses are very complex, and the motivations for different activities are also quite complex. And so I quickly, figured out that if I want to understand how to create lasting solutions. Maybe sometimes create lasting problems too. Those can be useful, but that I really had to understand the business a lot more. And similarly, working with Indigenous peoples, these are the peoples, about half of my work is there. People in Canada who've been on the land for 10,000 years, right, since the Ice Age. So you can't not be drawn to those communities, and in the Canadian context, they're fundamental to who we are. So I love the solution space that is diverse, because it's very challenging and it creates lasting solutions. And it's not to say that you don't. We don't need the Greenpeaces and the Rainforest Action Networks. We do. They create political space. But unless there's an opportunity for us to work together across sectors, then we'll always be in trench warfare and we'll never get to the solutions we need.
That makes a lot of sense. And I'd like to get a little bit more historical context and also current context on Canada specifically as it pertains to the mining and critical materials space, because I think it will help undergird several questions I have to follow up. So could you provide insight into, firstly, just like a very basic, how the Canadian government's structured? I know there are like many municipalities. I think could be wrong about this. Actually, don't even want to say the number of states that control. Like, how does that dynamic play out between states and federal, and then also with like these tribal governments? And then, in addition to that, can you just paint an overview of the mining industry in Canada?
Sure. So there are some interesting similarities and some important differences with the U.S. So we have 10 provinces, and then there are 3 territories, none of it being the most recent of those, but Northwest Territories and the Yukon. So the overarching federal responsibility is, healthcare, sort of levels of taxation. They are involved in some environmental, like fisheries and the care for water and protected areas. But when it comes to development, like the real permitting of mines and forestry and everything else, that tends to be that is a provincial responsibility. So there's a tension between like the Charter of Rights and Freedoms is a federal act, and you can't transgress that. So there's certain freedoms and certain rights that people have, but how those play out differently. And so the one other very important point is, as you mentioned, to tribal governments, the Indigenous communities and governments are protected under the Canadian Constitution, and that is a federal responsibility that cannot be delegated. So it's increasingly this interesting sort of tripartite federal, Indigenous, and provincial governments that have to work together to, especially in things like pipelines, for example, where you're crossing a series of boundaries. But that's, if I want to really affect a mine, I go to a provincial government.
I see.
But if I want to, inspire, a bigger policy or protection for Indigenous groups, we go to the federal government. So the mining industry is historically, one of the most important we have. It's guessing they will say 7 or 8% of our GDP is related to the mining, directly and indirectly. It's big. And of course, regionally, that differs quite a bit. Quebec, British Columbia have very strong mining, and Ontario have very strong mining industries because of their mineral endowment. It plays less of a role in some of the others. The far north as well has quite strong. They are the single most important, I think it's fair to say, that it's probably the single most effective lobby on Parliament Hill. So if you want to make progress, you better figure out what the mining industry is going to do, because they can kibosh it. Fortunately, there is quite progressive. The Mining Association of Canada is very different than most other industry associations. It actually upholds strong policy, and I work closely with them on a variety of things. We don't agree on everything, but they are very important politically, economically, and so one of the defining characteristics of the Canadian economy, I would say.
So then do they have to send whatever materials they mine to China in order to process and refine, or does Canada have their own inherent capabilities in order to actually convert that material into usable?
Pretty limited. There are some major smelters in Quebec that are, and there's also some steel refining. Ontario has some, but not a lot. And then British Columbia has aluminum, which is a big aluminum smelter out there. But if you use BC, for example, a big chunk of all of the copper, for example, goes to Japan and China. So the majority of our material goes out raw to others to process.
Got it. Which brings us nicely to current events, where there's a lot going on, especially in this area as it pertains to trade, geopolitics, critical minerals, and securing supply chains. So, and also Canada just had their election. So, I don't even know where to start.
Yeah. Well, there is something to thank Donald Trump for, and that is Mark Carney. His attacks really galvanized the Canadian public in a way that I don't think I've ever seen, really. I mean, the Liberals were on their way to political decimation. Trudeau had been in for 8 years, and incumbent government is always going to be bad, but he was a bit of a lightning rod for Western alienation and a whole range of things. They were tanking. And it was Pierre Poilievre, who the Conservatives, who's kind of like a mini Trump. I mean, if you look at his programs and you look at his style, he's not as powerful as Trump is, but he steals pretty much all of his ideas directly their way. So we were headed in that direction, I think fast.
He was up 15 points.
25 at one point.
25.
At one point, yeah. And now, essentially what happened at the beginning of this week was that the Liberals got, I think it's 167 seats. They need 172 for majority, but there's a New Democratic Party and the Greens collectively got 8. So we have the center-left in control of Parliament. Thank God. That was good. So that does allow us to have rational policy discussions. All of them know that the mining sector and the metals sector is a key ally there. But what's interesting to come around to the circularity question is that there's a big push on critical minerals and what they call the missing middle, which is the processing and manufacturing of those for batteries and for solar and for others. I mentioned in the talk earlier that Quebec had put $90 million into a 5-year strategy to go from geoscience to sort of the consumer products for batteries and everything in between to really reinvent their economy to allow for the full exploitation of value from critical minerals. And Ontario is doing the same, a little more rhetoric, a little less reality, but big important infilling of whole supply chains and manufacturing capacity. British Columbia is also looking at the same thing. So we are looking at a high degree of attention, but on critical minerals. But I should say also that there's the joint U.S.-Canada, I forgot the exact name of it, but it's the joint plan on critical minerals, and it's that Biden and Trudeau signed in together. And that's, I think, still stands a lot in terms of how you invest together to have a lot of the common areas that are important. I mean, whether we like it or not, critical minerals are a big part of weapons systems. And so what is happening is sort of an interesting piece we have to keep an eye on. But with rare earths and others, these are national security issues. And fortunately, the volume of critical minerals needed for weapons and things like fighter planes is relatively low compared to, say, solar or batteries or others, but it's there. So what may allow this to get under the radar a little bit is less of a focus on critical minerals and the green energy transition, but critical minerals and national security. So it'll be interesting to watch that dynamic play out over the next little while. So Canada is building in its economy and putting in hundreds of millions of dollars, if not billions, but I still believe strongly that the North American focus for materials flow, for exchange of processing and in consumer markets, for alignment on policy and incentives through supply chains, that's really, really important. And I don't think that's going to go away.
That makes sense. So what is the biggest barrier towards getting more processing capacity? Is it the technology, the financing? Do you feel like North America has the capabilities to bring that capacity onshore in the relatively near term? Could you paint a picture of where things stand and like where you feel like they could realistically get to?
Yeah, I think the short answer is yes. Where there's a will, there's a way, and there's a lot of discussion now on financing and de-risking this big transition, because private financing they're interested, but it's a very it's a new space, and there's a lot of financial risk, a lot of supply uncertainty, a lot of price uncertainty. And that just sort of goes with the nature of the different developments in technology, like which battery type is going to go and surge, for example. But also a lot of these materials are processed in different ways and don't trade on commodity markets. So they could go way up and then see their price collapse. If, for example, China wanted to collapse a market, they could flood a market with their own things. This is where tariffs, interestingly, could come in. So finance is a big thing, and I think there's got to be significant public finance involved. Everybody is saying that with infrastructure, with de-risking of some of the startups and the early investments, that public financing is going to have to play a big role in this. But obviously we want the follow-on there for the innovation financing to come in as well. So that, in the absence of that, things aren't going anywhere, and everybody talks about it right now, how tough it is. Mining doesn't have a great reputation in the finance and investment world, and they struggle to get that. So this will be a new development. Infrastructure is another big one, certainly in Canada. Power, rail, road, making sure we've got the right connections between sort of the mine sites, the regional hubs, making sure that material can flow where it needs to flow in order to meet these demands. And there's a lot of focus in Canada on infrastructure development to enable this sort of regional increase.
Which again brings in that interplay between the provinces, federal, and the tribal areas.
Yes, and this is an area we're very actively working on right now, trying to put together those diverse voices on a plan that's rooted in sustainability, but ultimately can develop regional capacity. But I think people are taking it as a given. This is going to happen, and
bringing the processing specifically?
Sure, and bring on board in increasing our capacity right now. I mean, the statistics are crazy in terms of what we're not capturing out of waste streams right now. So, see if I can get the figures. About half of the metals that are considered for industrial metals are less than 50% recycled, and about, I think, 30 of them are like 1% recycled. Now we have certain things like copper, lead, steel that are, getting up to 60 to 70 on a good day, but we're still leaving a massive amount there. So there is feedstock out there, but part of what we need to do is make sure that's captured. First, it's inventoried. We know where it is, which is a big problem in and of itself. So that's something that really has to happen is like mapping out the resources, the urban mines as well as the others. That includes existing tailings that need to be remined. So we need to find out where it is. We need to get the sort of the collection hubs in places where you can bring it into centralized centers, and the investment needs to be done there. And then there is a certain technology component to it, but I'm least worried about the technology. I'm more worried about the policy and the data and the sort of systems of logistics to move things between places so that you achieve a sort of a critical mass of market. Because right now it's very distributed and the volumes aren't sufficient to maintain this kind of upscaling that needs to go on if we're going to get there. So huge potential, really under-realized right now. And I think, if I were in business school, this is what I would be doing. I would be setting up myself to play a key role in that emerging economy.
Hope you're taking notes, audience.
Yes.
Final question. If Canada could implement one policy that you think would be a game changer in this area, Mark Carney might be listening to this episode right now. What would you tell him?
Well, one policy, I hate those questions, but they are a good challenge. They force you to go. It's partly a mindset shift as much as it is a policy, but it has policy implications. We have grown up in a waste-obsessed world. Unfortunately, we're still increasing our waste, but so we've protected ourselves from waste. And in doing so, we've locked waste into our economy. It's ironic, but that's true. It becomes normalized in the economy. So huge amounts of liability, huge amounts of waste are normalized. As I said, the mining industry, as an example, is about 99.5% waste and 0.5% byproduct. That's a whole industry.
Really?
Yeah, it's crazy. But
Wait, how does that work?
It shouldn't, but it does. So my point is that we need to completely rethink the idea of waste and think about it as a resource. So if waste becomes something that is not acceptable in society because it's bad accounting and you pay a price for generating waste, then waste suddenly can become a resource and a value. And we know that there are billions of dollars of this resource sitting out there unused in our economy, creating liabilities and creating whole economies that are super inefficient, what is referred to as a linear economy, a take, make, waste economy, as opposed to a circular one in which you design waste out of systems and you design waste into economic resource. This is happening in different areas. I mean, I happen to have the opportunity to work in the Nordics, particularly in Finland, to sort of watch how this happens in real time. But Critical Raw Materials Act in EU is pushing them in that direction, and they will be a richer society for it with fewer externalities, fewer liabilities. So, Mr. Carney, if you are watching, a commitment to circularity that treats waste as a resource and treats waste for what it can no longer be as accepted in society, that's the thing that turns us on our heads economically, ecologically, and I think socially.
So Mark Carney should also try and create technology which can enter people's minds and eliminate the word waste, just from the dictionary.
It is one of those things. Waste is a horrible thing to waste, and we've just internalized. It's just really bad accounting. And for business schools, this whole concept of normalization
100%.
of waste.
I mean, that 99.5% statistic is, I'm still trying to grapple with that. It's mind-blowing.
Yeah, no, the whole business model needs to change. It can change. And in doing so, it will create, incredible amount of economic value. While, by the way, eliminating huge amounts of liability. And so I think that's a really exciting opportunity. As I said earlier, I've been working on mining issues for about 30 years. And most of that time was spent in harm reduction, essentially avoiding the scenario in which things got killed or blown up or flooded or whatever. And, sometimes you have to do that. But I mean, I wouldn't have my dear iPad if it wasn't for the mining industry. So, we've got to take ownership of that, right? And throughout society. But what's happened with the circular economy is that this need for critical minerals as a way to, generate, transmit, and store renewable energy is transformed the role of the industry in the world economy. And in doing so, they've discovered that they have this incredibly recyclable, reusable, durable product that society can make much more out of. And so I think as we come to grips with the potential that's as of yet unrealized here, we'll move from harm reduction to transformation. And that is exciting.
Very exciting. Thank you. Thank you so much for your time and for this conversation. I learned a lot and
pleasure.
really appreciate it.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks so much for checking out the Zenergy Podcast. If you enjoyed today's episode, please take a moment to rate and subscribe to the podcast. It would mean so much to me and the rest of the team. We release episodes every Thursday, so stay tuned for all new episodes featuring industry leaders building a cleaner, greener future for us all. See you next time.